And we're live. Well, welcome back to the Bell's Cup podcast. I'm your host, David Bell. And on today's episode, we'll be taking a look at round 8 of the 2025 Formula One World Championship, with this week's Grand Prix being held at the legendary Circuit de Monaco in Monaco. So let's get ready for those 5 green lights and we'll be underway. And now, as per usual, we will take a look at the first and second practice sessions first. So within the first 10 minutes of the FP1 for the Monaco Grand Prix, the few issues were mainly related to Charles Leclerc, which hopefully aren't going to be an omen for what's to come later the weekend. So the first kind of real issue Leclerc had was a lockup on his front right tire, when he actually had to use the runoff area at turn 5 to avoid hitting the wall. But the second and more serious issue that he had came at the Fairmont hairpin, when actually Lance Stroll let a car pass him under blue flags, which you're supposed to do, you're kind of obliged to do. But he actually turned back onto the track without looking who's coming or what's behind him. And as Leclerc was approaching at speed, they actually collided together, with Stroll breaking his rear wing, the rear wing, the diffuser, and he actually had some damage to his floor, with Leclerc thankfully only having to replace his front wing on his Ferrari. Then the session was later red flagged to allow the marshal to remove any of the broken pieces of the car, any carbon fiber from the track. Then at the end of the first practice session, our top 3 fastest drivers were Leclerc in P1, Verstappen in P2, and Norris in P3. Now, moving on to the second practice session, or FP2. So before the session even started, we were kind of given an update that because of the crash between Stroll and Leclerc in FP1, Stroll was actually found at fault, no fucking surprise, and he was actually given a 1-place grid penalty for the race on Sunday. Now, once the session actually was underway, there was another red flag, which, as we kind of continue with the episode today, it'll be a bit of a known thing that Monaco is kind of known for red flags. But the kind of first red flag of the session, or should I say second red flag of the session, was actually waved as Isaac Hadjar had clipped the barrier onto the entrance to the Neuville chicane, and he actually stripped the tire straight off the rim, but he did manage to make it back to the pits. Then maybe about 5 seconds after Leclerc set the fastest time of the session so far, at around, say, the 41-minute mark, Piastri brought out yet another red flag as he locked both of his front wheels and speared straight into a barrier. But luckily, the collision itself was like an actual head-on collision. So the only thing that was damaged during the crash was his front wing. So he was able to reverse out, drive back to the pits, and them to basically stick a new front wing on, and him to continue the session as normal. But the second session saw our boys in red do a lot better than the previous sessions, or frankly, any race this season so far, with Leclerc finishing in P1 again, followed by Hamilton in P3. But Piastri actually managed to split the 2 Ferraris by reaching P2. So, but for now, we're going to move on to the Saturday for the final practice session and GP qualifying itself. Then in the final practice session, or FP3, for those who didn't notice it, like myself, during the second practice session, Ollie Berman actually overtook Carlos Sainz under red flag conditions, which is strictly forbidden. And as a result, Berman actually received a 10-place grid penalty for the Sunday's race, which is quite hefty. But he also got 2 penalty points given, or awarded. Can you say awarded when you get given a penalty? But they were actually put on his super license. Then within the last 3 minutes of the session, there yet again was another red flag waved, as Hamilton actually hit the wall at turn 3. And by the looks of the actual onboard cameras, he actually looked like he got a bit of a tank slapper, where he was trying to avoid the slow-moving cars in front of him, and he was actually driven into the wall where he smashed up the whole side of his car. But we were kind of even, was it told at the time? Can't really remember, or if it was going to be basically investigated later by the stewards for possible impeding. But then we actually were told in that session, to be fair, that there actually was no further investigation needed. But as that red flag was within, say, like the last 3 minutes, it actually basically ended the session for the day. But again, our top three fastest drivers of that session were Leclerc in P1 again, Verstappen in P2, then we had Norris in P3. And now, moving away from the practice sessions, we're going to move on to the qualifying sessions. Starting off with Q1. So Q1 itself was a relatively boring session. But at the start of the session, we actually saw Hamilton manage to get back out onto the track after his crash in FP3. And it looks like his mechanics actually did a pretty good job repairing his car in time. So he didn't have to miss any time of the session, or frankly didn't have to miss qualifying kind of in general, where he would have had to start in the last place in P20, basically. Then at the last possible moment of the session, Kimi Antonelli actually crashed his car on turn 11 and brought out yet another red flag. But the kind of shit thing about his crash is his time actually saw him through into Q2, but he obviously wouldn't take part in the session because he smashed his fucking car to bits. But we did lose 5 drivers at the end of the session, those being Bortoleto, Berman, Gasly, Stroll, and Carlo Pinto. Then in Q2, surprise, surprise, we saw another red flag waved, which is just typical of Monaco, being it's such a tight, narrow street circuit. It's easy for drivers to go off or make mistakes. But it was waved because of George Russell. It looked like his car actually lost power on the way up the hill to Casino, and it managed to actually coast back down the hill through the tunnel, where he actually had to stop in the tunnel. The reason why the red flag, because you can't obviously stop in the middle of a fucking blind turn. So the marshals actually had to push his car out of the tunnel into one of the wee kind of side, would you call it side streets or kind of park up areas, whatever, for the car to be transported back to Mercedes in their garage. But after Russell's car troubles, the session was relatively uneventful, as these are the best drivers in the world. They don't make a lot of mistakes, but we did lose our final 5 drivers, those being Sainz, Tsunoda, Hülkenberg, Russell, and Antonelli. Then just following on what I said from Q2, looking at Q3, again, these are the top 10 best drivers in the world, so there was no real issues in terms of crashes, blown tires, fucking contact between drivers. None of that. It was just a pretty standard Monaco qualifying. But after setting a new track record in qualifying, Lando Norris took pole position with a time of 1 minute 09.954. And in doing so, he unfortunately snapped pole position away from the local hero Leclerc by a tenth of a second. But Leclerc himself did finish in P2, followed by Piastri in P3 and Hamilton in P4. So it was the 2 Ferraris and the 2 McLarens up on the front row. Now our boys have some work to do on the Sunday with those mandatory 2 pit stops. Now that does present some opportunities for some undercuts for some teams to kind of trying to take an advantage of those pit stops. If Ferrari is going to do that, I guess we'll find out in literally a couple of seconds. But I think we'll see a lot of teams, or a few teams, kind of get rid of that kind of extra pit stop in the first lap or 2. Or frankly, we'll probably see some taken right at the very end, as it's an extra pit stop. It probably doesn't fucking matter to team strategies. But for now, we'll take a look ahead to how the race actually turned out on Sunday. And now on Sunday, for the race that every driver wants to win, the Monaco Grand Prix. So on the opening laps, we actually saw action straight off the bat, as per typical for Monaco, as it being such a tight circuit. But Bortoleto tried to overtake Kimi on the exit of that Fairmont hairpin, but then Kimi tried to take the position back, literally in the following corner. but in doing so, it looked like he forced Bortoleto wide into the corner, which caused him to crash into the barrier. But after the review of that incident that was put in by the stewards and the FAA, Kimi was actually ahead at the apex of the corner, so he had the right to that corner, which Bortoleto, frankly, that's obviously at the time, you can't obviously judge fucking millimeters when your car's moving at 60, 70 miles an hour around a corner, but could have, and should have pulled out of the corner or conceded the corner to Kimi, and he would have avoided crashing and dropping down to last place. Then on lap 8 of 78, Gasly had some decent contact with Yuki on the exit of the tunnel, where Gasly actually ran into the back of Yuki and smashed up the front left wheel and smashing up his whole kind of suspension. But the big controversy of the crash is if Gasly should have pulled over to the side of the track, as his car was all smashed up and he was spraying pieces of carbon, pieces of car all over the track. And that could have caused punctures for other drivers, or frankly, it could have caused worse for drivers to get a puncture, crash, and God knows what would have happened then. But I would not be surprised to see next weekend in Barcelona if Gasly or Alpine, or frankly both, receiving some sort of penalty going into that race. Then on lap 38, Alonso had to retire his car due to a power unit issue. Now, it was believed to be going to be investigated later, kind of investigated internally, to discover what actually caused the problem. But we even see from the race there was smoke billowing out of the back of his car, so something broke. Then this new two-stop kind of race in Monaco saw a very different approach to team strategy, mainly kind of the midfield teams holding up the pack, but we'll talk about that in a little bit in a wee second. But basically, as Albon was one of the people who was holding up the pack in the latter stages of the race, trying to build a gap for his teammate Sainz, but to basically trying to help him anytime he tried to make that extra pit stop, he could have not lost track position to where he could have made the pit stop and basically came out of the pits back into his original position again. But Russell actually decided to cut the chicane to get ahead of Albon, but the stewards were on that shit like flies on shit, where he was actually given a drive-through penalty, which was basically a 20-second penalty for doing that, which, I mean, to be fair, it didn't really affect his finish position. He dropped maybe one or two positions because of how big those gaps were. So it wasn't necessarily a bad idea for him to do that. On the kind of latter stages of the race, Leclerc was on Lando's ass the entire time. Within like the last 10, 15 laps, Leclerc was actually getting quite close to Lando. And God almighty, I was hoping for him to gain some sort of advantage and try and overtake him to gain P1. But unfortunately, after Max having to come into the pits on lap 77, that just opened the door for Lando to race in clean air. And bro, it's the views from that sky cam. Those McLarens are fucking rocket ships. He just bolted off into the distance, just leaving Leclerc in his wake. But unfortunately, that brings us to the end of the Monaco Grand Prix. But a big congrats to Lando Norris for his first win in Monaco, who was unfortunately followed in P2 by Leclerc, the home hero, then followed by his teammate Piastri in P3. Then in terms of these new pit stop rules in Monaco, I'm straight up just not a fan. I don't think it worked. It put too much of an emphasis on the pit stops rather than the actual racing itself, with the teams kind of dividing their strategies to where they sacrifice their B driver to basically back the cars up so their A driver could basically get some clear track ahead. If they needed to pit, they could pit and basically not lose track position and kind of come out back into a spot where they were. But if that's going to evolve over time, I'm sure it will. I'm not the only one who thinks that kind of plan or the new regulations just didn't work for Monaco. But again, hopefully they're going to be tweaked over the next couple of years. We'll frankly see what happens. It's sad to see Monaco be such a boring race for how legendary the place is, how legendary the track is. It's been on the calendar since Formula One existed, basically, with Juan Manuel Fangio being the first ever driver to win Monaco. To see what it is now, it's just disappointing. Other than that rant, we will look ahead to next week where we're in Barcelona for the Spanish Grand Prix. And with that will do us for this week's episode of the Bells Club podcast. Now, I want to thank you for listening to this week's episode. And if you enjoyed, feel free to follow us here on wherever you get your podcasts. And I look forward to talking to you all next week for round 9 or the Spanish Grand Prix. Goodbye, everybody.